Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we step into the quiet, late-night streets of Detroit, where the glow of streetlights reflects off empty asphalt and power moves in whispers, not shouts. This is the world of Jack Tocco, a man known for calm authority rather than chaos, where respect was earned through discretion, and every move was measured, never rushed. Most people couldn't survive a life like this, not because of fear, but because it required absolute control in a world where trust was fragile and silence meant survival. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy these long, slow journeys through history's darker corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the city hum fade, and settle in as we ease into the quiet, calculating story of Jack Tocco. The night the river learned to keep its own silence, a young boy stood at the edge of the dock and watched lights ripple like patient promises. He listened to the slow, indifferent breath of the city and felt, as so many boys feel when they grow into the world, that there are voices which shout to be heard and voices that must learn to wait. That waiting, he would come to understand, can be a kind of strength. Jack Tocco was not a boy who wanted to be noticed. He preferred corners where conversations bent into secret places, where men and women traded news in the low register of people who measured things by their consequences rather than their noise. His neighborhood taught him, early, two competing lessons. That reputation matters, and that reputation should never be flaunted. People remembered how you made them feel in the mornings. The steadiness of a delivery on time, the quiet helping hand when a hinge jammed, the neighbor who covered a small debt because pride is a poor substitute for bread. Those were the currencies that accustomed Jack to the idea that life is built from a string of tiny accounts. He learned to read rooms the way others read maps. A disinterested shrug, the precise pause before someone answered a question, the way a hand reached for a cigarette and then put it down. These things told him more than any speech. He watched elders who solved problems with a look rather than a lecture. He watched men who wore their authority like a coat. Never too tight, never brand new. The lesson was practical and almost domestic. Power that needs to announce itself is power that cannot sustain itself. School gave him little more than a mechanical literacy and a taste for figures. Real education waited in the streets, in the warehouses, in the long afternoons spent watching how goods arrived and how people managed the thin margin between enough and not enough. He apprenticed himself, in a way, to the city's rhythms. He learned which trucks came late in winter, which suppliers tightened credit in July, which clerks could be reasoned with over coffee. Pattern recognition, practiced day by day, made him useful. Usefulness, in turn, gathered people who preferred reliability over spectacle. There is a kind of quiet ambition that does not look like ambition at all. It looks like fidelity to routine. Jack's early choices reflected this. He preferred steadiness, predictable returns, and the cumulative value of small favors repaid on time. He did not seek headlines. He cultivated what some call influence, the slow accretion of people's trust through repeated acts that made life more livable. He discovered, as he watched the city turn its small wheels, that influence built on predictability is more durable than anyone's bluster. As he grew older, he found himself moving through rooms of negotiations with a low-key competence that made others lean on him. He was never the loudest voice at a table, but he often said the things that made the argument practical. He would ask, in a voice that carried the weight of arithmetic rather than rhetoric, who pays when this plan goes wrong? The question seemed mundane until someone had to answer it in the middle of a bad month. Then the mundanity was everything. There are choices in life that are less about morality and more about consequence. Jack's world presented those choices often. Accept easy profit and watch it reshape neighborhoods, or insist on slow approaches that keep people's mornings intact. He learned to prefer the latter, not in any abstract moralism, but because he had seen what happens when quick money arrives without thought. Friendships fray, businesses shudder, and the kind of trust that feeds a community becomes a memory. He thought of the city as a living economy of habits, and he wanted to keep its habits whole. That did not mean he was naive about the realities of survival. He knew the city has no shortage of hunger and that people make hard bargains when their backs are near a wall. He learned to make deals that included buffers, small funds that covered a missed payroll, arrangements that kept suppliers alive through paperwork delays, and a network of people who could step in when a truck failed or a route closed. These arrangements were not headlines. They were a kind of infrastructure, social plumbing, that allowed ordinary lives to proceed when the system hiccuped. Patience, to Jack, was an activity rather than a posture. It required the mental discipline to wait for the right moment to act and the humility to step back when one's intervention would merely exacerbate attention. He was not indifferent to power. He wanted it to have purpose. He valued discretion because it preserved the dignity of everyday people. When a problem could be solved privately, he preferred to solve it in private. The fewer public wounds a community carried, the fewer grudges hardened into grudges that last generations. Longevity suited his temperament. There was a kind of craft to living long in a place of shifting alliances. Compartmentalize, legislate small favors into clear expectations, and protect the mournings of those who matter. He learned to be the man others called not because they wanted to make news, but because they needed someone to make things right. Reliability became his signature, and in the world he moved through signatures count. As his responsibilities grew, so did the complexity of his choices. Bigger promises require bigger scaffolding. A single misstep, an unguarded contract, an unpaid claim, a public humiliation, can have ripple effects. Jack invested in the small but crucial work of building systems. Simple rules that everyone could see and enforce, modest funds to cover contingencies, and clear procedures for dispute resolution. The aim was not to eliminate risk. The world is full of the unforeseen, but to make risk survivable. He learned to choose partners by a simple test. If someone could explain how a plan hurt when it failed, they were more likely to be responsible when it did. People who could not articulate consequences often assumed someone else would pay for cleanup. That kind of moral laziness is costly. Jack preferred collaborators who counted the cost before they counted the gain. He would not sign away a neighborhood's stability for the promise of a fast return. One of his quieter skills was translation. He could read between the lines of the charts that investors produced and translate them into the facts of a family's week, payday schedules, school runs, unpaid rent cycles. He taught people in meeting rooms to do that too. When an engineer or a financier talked about efficiency gains, he would ask, gently and persistently, who goes without the week the model fails. That question redirected conversations from abstraction to people, and once people were in the room, conversations took on a different gravity. Discretion is sometimes misread as passivity. It is not. Discretion is a form of strategy that reserves force for when it truly matters and uses negotiation to prevent escalations. Jack's diplomacy was forensic. He collected small facts, held them without drama, and then used them to shape agreements that others considered durable. He liked to think of his role as a steward of continuity, tending the things that let people plan their days. The city is full of ephemeral triumphs. He preferred to shepherd habits. There were costs to this life. Saying no to rapid expansion sometimes meant losing immediate opportunities, and refusing certain deals could breed resentment among those who preferred speed. He accepted those costs as a kind of tuition for keeping a pattern that benefits many rather than a few. He measured success not by the size of his bank account or the number of headlines that bore his name, but by the count of mornings that opened reliably for people who mattered to him. Bakers, clerks, drivers, small proprietors who pensioned their trust in systems, rather than personalities. Power concentrations sometimes invite scrutiny. Jack learned that the best defense against scrutiny is not secrecy for secrecy's sake, but the creation of institutions that make one's actions legible and accountable to the right people. He worked to make committees that could adjudicate disputes, funds that could be audited, and procedures that made it harder for any single person to hoard authority. Discretion remained a personal value, but institutional transparency reduced the temptation for others to weaponize gossip into ruin. Trust, once built, changes the kinds of work one can do. People bring you problems that require not only a fix but a judgment about what should continue afterward. Jack became good at calibrating remedies, short-term provisions that covered immediate harm, and structural changes that reduced the likelihood of the harm recurring. He invested his time in the boring work of maintenance, making sure contracts were clear, that reimbursements had defined timelines, and that a human could be reached when an algorithm went wrong. He understood that the most useful systems are the ones that make repair routine. As he grew older, he also grew reflective. The city is an accumulation of stories, some bright and some bruised. He found himself thinking often about the moral logic of repair. When do you invest in a person and when do you write it off? His answer favored generosity with accountability. He would rather lend a hand with clear terms than write a blank check of pity. In his view, dignity is preserved when assistance is given with respect and expectation of responsibility. Helps that followed this geometry made people steadier long-term. There were softer things that sustained him. A steady cup of coffee at the same table, the precise notes of a neighborhood choir that met on Thursdays, the small ritual of walking one particular route at dusk. Those rituals were not indulgences. They were anchors that reminded him of why he undertook the harder work. If you cannot remember what mornings feel like when they are good, it is hard to design systems to keep them so. And still, the world pushed. New technologies arrived promising speed and clarity. Investors with fresh capital whispered futures that would look tidy on a balance sheet. Each change asked the same questions. Who benefits in the short term, and who bears the cost if the plan fails? Jack met these proposals with the patience that had guided him since the docks. He favored pilots with human override provisions, escrowed funds for contingencies, and governance structures that included those whose lives were most affected. The proposals that agreed to those conditions were useful. Those that did not were suspect. There were nights when he allowed himself to imagine stepping back, letting others take the seams he had sutured and continue the work without him. That thought was not abdication. It was the point of his labor. A practice that depends on a single man is not a practice. It is an emergency waiting to happen. So he apprenticed people, handed over small authorities, and designed processes that made repair procedural rather than personal. His reputation, in time, was not built on legend but on a quieter ledger. People who could get paid when their payrolls faltered, drivers who could take time off without panic, shops that could reorder credit when supplies failed. Those things are easy to overlook in grand narratives but vital to the everyday. He took pride in being part of that machinery, invisible as the gears that make a clock tell true time. Towards the end of the first stage of his life's work, he found himself sitting by the river again, watching the city lights blur and thinking about what endurance demands. Humility, procedurality, and the stubborn insistence that the costs of progress be visible and addressed. He had seen too many schemes that looked good on paper and terrible in practice. He had accumulated a set of practices that made damage reparable and made promises real, that he thought might be the most one could do, to arrange so that ordinary lives could carry on. The world would change again as it always does. New platforms would come with their own logics, and new leaders would test old agreements. But the habits he had nurtured felt like a kind of inheritance, one that could be passed on as much in binders and bylaws as in the small human rituals he loved. He had no illusions about being immortal. He wanted, instead, to create a practice that could survive him. When morning came the next day, it found Jack already moving through the neighborhood in the ordinary way he liked. A brief stop for coffee, a nod to the shopkeeper who always unfolded the newspaper in the same place, a glance at the trucks as they were loaded for the first runs. The river had given him a quiet lesson. Now the city gave him a busy list of small tasks, and he liked that order. Work that matters is rarely grand. It is the accumulation of small, competent acts, calls made before noon, favors repaid in the currency of punctuality, schedules adjusted so a mother could make a school run. His influence deepened not because he sought it, but because people learned they could count on him. Reputation is a compound interest. A week of reliable mornings begets one more week, which begets a habit of trust. People began to bring him problems that required not only a solution but a judgment about what should happen afterward. Should a supplier be forgiven for a missed payment if the reason was illness? Should a longtime clerk be protected from a new scheduling algorithm that refused to account for her caregiving duties? Jack's answers were practical and precise. Short-term relief paired with conditions that made the relief a step toward recovery, not a permanent crutch. As his web of obligations grew, he built small mechanisms that made promises enforceable. A community fund, modest and ring-fenced, could bridge payrolls when a shipment stalled. A simple written agreement that multiple neighbors signed could keep a credit line open for a small grocer who had backed a family through illness. He loved these things not because they were clever, but because they worked. They turned private kindness into public reliability, and reliability is the quiet engine of any town that does not want to fray at the edges. His days also brought him into larger rooms where language differed. Men in suits spoke of efficiency and scale and smiled as if spreadsheets were gospel. Engineers described optimization as if the world's problems could be reduced to variables. Jack listened. He learned to translate their talk into the arithmetic of a family's month. If your model misses 1 week, he would say evenly, show me the names of the people who will go unpaid, and how will they be made whole? That question had a way of recalibrating proposals from abstract to accountable. Some men left annoyed. Others returned with different terms. He discovered that influence is often a matter of architecture rather than fist or fame. If you can design the right kinds of contracts, ones that require escrow for worst-case scenarios, joint governance for shared platforms, and human override features for algorithms, you can make the consequences of haste legible before people sign their names. He began to write into deals not only what would happen when things succeeded, but what would happen when plans failed. The planning for failure felt less glamorous than promises of success, but in practice it mattered more. People who knew him well saw another side. His patience could be fierce. When he believed a line should not be crossed, he would insist with the same quiet force with which he had always preferred to speak. It was not theatrical. It was methodical. If a new partner wanted the neighborhood to accept a rapid rollout, he would accept only after the partner demonstrated a willingness to bind capital to the safety net. If a politician wanted to tout a smart city rollout, Jack required that pilot projects must prove they could keep small operators whole before scaling. He was not acting like an obstructionist. He was acting like someone who had watched plans be beautiful on paper and disastrous in practice. That history made his insistence hard to ignore. There were moments when law and curiosity arrived in the same week. Outside scrutiny tends to focus on spectacle, and spectacle is not Jack's medium. Investigations and audits came as part of the landscape of influence, an external pressure that demanded clarity. He learned to make sure the right things were transparent, that the escrow's accounting could be audited, that the governance board minutes were recorded, that the neighborhood's commitments were defensible in public. Transparency, he found, is both a shield and a discipline. When procedures are legible, rumor finds less purchase. He also learned the limits of what institutions can do alone. People are not inputs on a spreadsheet. They have histories, fears, and obligations that an algorithm will not respect unless someone teaches it to. So he taught. Lectures, informal briefings, rides along on night runs, these were the classrooms he liked. He invited engineers to stand in warehouses at 4 in the morning and watch how a single delayed truck ripples through a week's worth of livelihoods. He asked politicians to come on runs so they could see what a family's morning looks and feels like. He asked investors to fund retraining programs and community liaisons before they were allowed to claim the label of modernization. The work of education wore on him at times, but it was necessary if the structures he'd built were to become habitual rather than brittle. There were softer threads woven through the daily arithmetic. He made a point of knowing people's small routines, the way a baker liked his dough rested 2 hours longer on Tuesdays, or that a mechanic always preferred the first light for engine checks. These trivialities were not mere trivia. They were the warp and weft of lives. Remembering them signaled to people that he noticed them as whole, not merely as nodes in a network. It kept his decisions tethered to real experience rather than models alone. Family held its own place in his life, quieter and more private. He kept a small ritual, an evening call to an older relative, a birthday remembered in ways that mattered. These were not PR moments but stabilizing acts. In the long run of making things possible for others, the personal anchors kept him humane. He believed that the ability to keep a neighbor's morning intact was rooted in one's ability to remember what mornings look like for one's own family. A child's breakfast, a partner's schedule, the small negotiations that make love survivable. Time brought apprentices, people who arrived with curiosity and the kind of humility Jack respected. Some were technicians who could read code but lacked a sense for the human rhythms that code could break. Others were organizers who knew community but not contracts. He liked to pair them. Engineers who learned to see people's constraints, and community organizers who learned the language of legal enforcement. That pairing became the neighborhood's secret sauce. When an algorithm tried to outrun a human need, there would be someone to hit pause and someone else to explain why pause mattered. Apprentices learned not to seek glory but to master the quotidian craft of fixing things before anyone felt obliged to notice. One autumn, a dispute surfaced that tested the network's mettle. A well-financed newcomer had won a contract to streamline deliveries along a critical corridor. Their promise was speed. Their assumption was that the system would adapt. But speed without restraint started to erode a long-running credit arrangement that had kept a small hardware store alive for decades. Vendors began to talk about closing on weeks when cash flow was tight. People started to imagine a neighborhood without the familiar chirp of the hardware bell and, with it, fewer opportunities to make the small favors that kept families afloat. Jack convened a meeting in a room that smelled of coffee and old wood. He listened to the newcomer's glossy presentation, then asked that quiet, practical question about the arithmetic of failure. The newcomer's lawyers presented indemnities and clauses that looked tidy until Lucia, one of the apprentices who had spent hours in ledgers, pointed out how the indemnities triggered only after long legal processes. That delay, she argued plainly, would not help a proprietor with rent due next week. Jack cut through the legalese with a single proposition. A temporary bridge fund, funded proportionally by the newcomer and matched by local capital, to cover immediate impacts while contracts were tested. He insisted on binding language and a rapid access protocol so a shopkeeper could get help within 48 hours of a verified shortfall. It was a compromise that cost momentum but preserved the mornings. The newcomer balked but accepted, and the hardware store stayed. The concession was small in the ledger of ventures but enormous to the proprietors who could now plan for their children's needs. Moments like this taught apprentices how leverage works. Not as a tool to force outcomes, but as a responsibility to protect the contingent costs that people live with every day. There were nights of doubt. He would sometimes sit at his kitchen table with the ledger he kept, names and promises and quiet annotations, and feel the weight of the obligations multiply. Public life collects claims the same way a storm collects fallen leaves. The apprentices could carry much, but burdens have a way of finding the softest shoulders. He started to think about succession not as an exit but as an insurance policy. Who will answer the morning calls when he is not there at 3 a.m.? He built decision trees, delegated authority in writing, and insisted that the apprentices rotate responsibilities so no single absence became a calamity. Delegation is not simply handing off tasks. It is the hard work of distributing habit until it becomes communal. Sometimes the world punished discretion with misunderstanding. Men who preferred public theater accused him of hiding things. Others who preferred headlines called his methods old-fashioned. He accepted that misinterpretation as an occupational hazard. He knew why scrutiny favored drama. It makes news because it is sudden and loud. But the rhythm that mattered, the one that turned a week's missed payroll into a solvable problem instead of a crisis, rarely fit a headline. He preferred it that way, yet the quiet life still drew attention. A journalist, curious about a neighborhood that seemed inexplicably resilient, asked to ride along on a morning. Jack agreed on one condition. The journalist observed without publishing for a week, to see the ordinary things that keep mornings intact. The ride-along yielded small scenes. A baker receiving his flour in time because a driver took a longer but safer route. A shopkeeper who avoided rent trouble because of a prompt, discreet bridge loan. An engineer pausing an algorithmic reassignment that would have forced a parent to miss a crucial appointment. The journalist wrote later, Not a sensational piece, but a careful profile about the value of repair. The attention was welcome not because it praised him, but because it made the neighborhood's practices legible to other people who might adopt them. As years pressed on, the scale of his choices grew. Larger investors, some with more aggressive timelines, offered sums that would drastically alter the neighborhood's skyline. Towers were never his taste, but he understood the pressures that drove others toward them. He learned to say no sometimes and to say yes with conditions at other times. He knew that refusing money could be prudent, but also that refusing to modernize entirely risked stagnation and the slow erosion of opportunity. The balance was delicate. Keep the mornings intact while allowing enough growth to expand choices for the young. There were moments of real human reward. An apprentice he'd mentored opened a training program that placed local youth into logistics jobs with stable hours and clear career ladders. A baker's child, who once struggled to afford school supplies, completed a degree in culinary arts and returned to open a small shop of her own. These were the victories that did not make news, but they reinforced the logic of his life. That careful, procedural work over years changes lives more than a single flashy victory ever can. On evenings when the city seemed particularly patient, he walked the same route and noticed signs of small, ordinary flourishing. A window painted, a stoop swept, a child's laugh carried across the air. He felt both relief and a cautious pride. The practices he had helped create were not immutable laws. They were habits, and habits require attention. He did not romanticize his role. He had made mistakes, lost some arguments, and seen some friends leave for brighter, quicker promises. But the ledger held more entries marked repaid than owed, and that counted for much. Still, the future always arrived with a different face. New algorithms, new platforms, and fresh capital would require new kinds of scrutiny and new forms of elbow grease. He had learned to treat the future like a prototype rather than a finished monument. Pilot, measure, repair. That mantra had kept the mornings coming. He trusted that it would keep doing so, provided people remained willing to ask the practical questions and to bind promises with enforceable commitments. The year turned, and with it came a different kind of weather, less rain than pressure, less force than scrutiny. Pressure arrives in polite envelopes now. Audits, compliance requests, invitations to formal hearings where everyone wears a suit that pretends impartiality. The neighborhood felt the change as a hum under usual rhythms. A new inspector at the docks who asked for extra manifests. A city auditor who wanted to review escrow disbursements. A council member eager to be seen holding a ribbon at a hub opening. None of it should have been startling. Change is always accompanied by paperwork. Still, the arrival of formality carries with it a practical lesson. If you want your practices to last, teach them how to live in the light. Jack liked paperwork that meant something. He preferred that it be useful rather than ceremonial. So when auditors arrived with clipboards and polite frowns, he met them with binders that smelled of long afternoons and careful hands. Transaction logs, minutes from governance meetings, signed access protocols for human override. He showed not to defend himself, but because he believed that transparency is a habit that breeds steadiness. The auditors ended up pausing as they read. They did not find scandal. They found a neighborhood that had turned repair into routine. They took notes, nodded at the documentation, and left satisfied enough to tell their bosses there was no crisis, only a model worth studying. What surprised him more was when an old legal question resurfaced. One of those small complications that had been settled quietly years before, but which politics and electoral cycles love to drag back into the light. Someone in a higher office wanted an example of modernization the city could point to at a conference. They requested a public presentation and, with it, a set of very public numbers. Numbers are dangerous when they replace people. They tell tidy stories and encourage tidy choices. Jack agreed to the presentation but insisted on the terms. Include human cost metrics, include escrow accounting, and allow a live Q&A where shopkeepers and drivers could speak. The request happened. Publicly, and the city's staff balked at the conditions, but they agreed. The audience that night was full: politicians, engineers, investors, and ordinary people who wanted to see whether the talk matched the work. At the podium, Jack spoke simply. He described the habits the neighborhood had cultivated: Pilot, measure, repair. He explained why a 3-month escrow matters in practical terms and how a human override can save a week's wages. He handed the microphone to drivers and shopkeepers who spoke about small failures made solvable by routines rather than grand charity. The room listened. Some politicians looked uncomfortable when shopkeepers asked about rents and parents asked about predictable schedules. A journalist in the back later wrote that the night exposed an inconvenient truth. Systems designed for speed look efficient until someone's child misses a school bus because an algorithm reassigned a driver. The piece was kind rather than sensational, but it spread. People began to ask the same questions Jack had asked in quieter rooms, that he thought was useful work. Not everyone was pleased. There are minds that prefer tidy narratives. Scale equals good, disruption equals progress, and they do not like caveats. They view caution as friction. A faction of newer investors, hungry for rapid returns, began to murmur that the neighborhood's insistence on escrow and local vetoes made it unattractive as a place to back at scale. They circulated alternative pilots elsewhere, places with fewer social obligations and faster timelines. Jack did not begrudge them. Capital follows the path that best suits its appetite. He worried only when those investors came back with shiny promises that left no safety net and asked, gently, that the neighborhood trust them and step aside. He refused those requests not because he loved friction, but because he had watched the cost of leap-first choices. Instead, he invited those investors to a different conversation. Fund a retraining program, place a seed for a local microcredit facility, or match escrow funds in proportion to their stake. If they wanted the neighborhood's participation, they had to share the cost of making failure survivable. Some accepted the proposal. Others moved to other districts. That was fine. Partnerships are reciprocal. Those who left taught a lesson too. The neighborhood's model made some capital uncomfortable precisely because it insisted on visible responsibility. The apprentices provided another kind of test. They had come of age, capable, confident, and full of their own ideas. That is a healthy hazard. New voices push boundaries, and not all boundaries are worth keeping. One afternoon, a younger manager proposed a radical reallocation of routes to eliminate apparent inefficiencies. The model showed better margins and promised to boost earnings in the good months. But it also eliminated many of the spare runs that had served as buffer for the unpredictable months. When he pitched it, eyes lit up at the thought of optimization. The apprentices studied the model and then ran scenarios. Tornado weeks, permit delays, sudden demand spikes. The numbers that looked pretty in the right light collapsed under stress unless certain guarantees were in place. Jack did not veto the idea outright. He respected innovation, but he insisted on a test. Deploy the change for a short pilot in a limited zone, fund a temporary guarantee for anybody who lost work during that pilot, and convene a weekly review. He pushed the team to define the pilot's exit criteria before it began, hard thresholds that would trigger a rollback or an expansion. The manager agreed, annoyed but practical. The pilot ran, showed some efficiency gains, and then hit a surprise. A bridge closure that rerouted traffic for a week. The pilot's protections activated. The escrow bridged payrolls and the pilot paused. The rollout was delayed until adjustments made the model less likely to punish people in weeks when infrastructure failed. The innovation did not die. It learned to be less cruel. Jack liked that outcome because it showed the model's underlying strength, not the power to block progress, but the power to fold it into a humane envelope. Progress that could not survive a bridge closure was brittle. Progress that could be paused, audited, and made right when it misfired was stronger. The apprentices celebrated by buying him a modest bottle of wine and insisting he taste it, their way of saying thanks for letting them try and fail and try again without punishment. Family and friends continued to anchor him. An elder in the community, the kind of person whose presence makes a room quieter, fell ill. The neighborhood rallied with the pragmatism Jack had always prized. Someone brought soup. Another person rearranged shifts so the elder's daughter could take 2 days. A small fund covered the medical copay. Jack sat at the bed for a long evening and thought about lineage. Influence, he realized, shapes futures as much as it shapes the present. He felt an urgency to make the structures he'd built durable, not only because they made mornings possible, but because they were the kind of inheritance that did not require bloodlines to pass on. Politics, meanwhile, hummed along its own track. A new mayor came in with a mandate for urban renewal. The administration liked tidy narratives of modernization and wanted quick wins. Several programs were offered: grants for consolidation, tax incentives for hubs, and a pilot to make the city last-mile ready. The mayor's office invited neighborhood leaders for a summit. Jack accepted the invitation and asked for 3 guarantees before the city hosted any public event using the neighborhood as a model: that the city would include human cost metrics in its reports, that any pilot would include a binding escrow requirement, and that local governance representatives would have a seat at the table when code changes affected. Scheduling. The mayor's staff grumbled about process but agreed. The city needed credibility as much as the neighborhood needed protection. During the summit, Jack listened as policy wonks talked about machine learning and dynamic routing. He asked about liable parties and emergency payment timelines. He asked who would sign checks at 2 in the morning if a borough-wide technical failure wiped the platform's matching logic. Officials shuffled. Some answers were bureaucratic and slow. Jack emphasized one simple rule: if you cannot make a person whole within 48 hours of a verifiable failure, you do not have a system you should scale. It is a low bar, he said, but one that saves a week of worry for a family. The rule gained traction with some city council members who had seen the human costs of rapid, unguarded rollouts. One night, after a long day of meetings and a city aide's RSVP, Jack walked home beside the river and thought about legacy in a concrete, almost architectural way. Legacy is not the grand stone in a park. It is the plumbing that keeps a house functioning. You notice plumbing only when it breaks, and then you learn to appreciate its importance afterward. He wanted his plumbing to be legible, distributable, and boring. Boring in the right sense, in the way that a reliable faucet is boring and beautiful. He pressed the point at every opportunity because he knew people who had ambitions, some of them good, who nevertheless mistook speed for justice. He had seen too many initiatives where the poor were told to benefit from disruption only for the benefits to arrive as jobs in far-off districts instead of concrete relief at home. So he taught, in meetings and along routes, about accounting for failure. He taught people to construct proposals that included downside protection in proportion to upside promises. The language of risk sharing, he said, is the most practical language for people who want systems that endure. Education extended outward. The apprenticeship program he and colleagues had crafted now had a small curriculum: human-first design for technologists, contract literacy for organizers, practical finance for small business owners. They ran workshops, wrote up templates for joint governance, and published a short manual that municipal staffers could actually use. It was not a book people read for pleasure, but it was the kind of tool a clerk could consult at 2 a.m. and find the kind of checklist that averts costly delays. The manual's modest circulation pleased him more than any op-ed. Practical tools, he had found, multiply faster than rhetoric. Through it all, his temperament remained the same: low-key, slightly mischievous in private moments, and relentlessly practical in public ones. He valued small gestures of dignity. He insisted that the neighborhood's drivers have a place to rest, clean bathrooms at the hub, and a clear schedule posted each week. He fought for coffee and a small stipend for apprentices who had to miss work for training. These things were not expensive relative to the benefits. They were simple, humane investments that paid dividends in loyalty and less friction. In the quieter months, he took a few small trips, not for deals, but to sit in other neighborhoods and listen. One winter, he spent a week in a port town with a different history and learned that local culture matters. A city's habits can render rules inert or potent. The trip reminded him that templates must be adapted and that humility matters in replication. He returned to his street with new questions and a renewed sense of the work he had set into motion. The apprentices grew more assertive, at times challenging choices he made out of habit. They argued for bolder campaigns: a public-facing fund to match investor capital, a web tool to make escrow claims more transparent, a more visible media strategy that could press the city towards sounder policy. He listened, sometimes resisted, and sometimes agreed. He preferred iteration to revolution, Small steps that accumulated rather than a single leap that risks everything. Their energy tempered his caution. His caution tempered their urgency. The blend felt right. The year closed with a small, quiet accomplishment. The neighborhood's escrow mechanism, now audited and publicly summarized, was adopted as a recommended model in a municipal toolkit. It did not come with fanfare. Instead, it arrived as a clause in a larger municipal program and a small grant to seed similar funds elsewhere. That bureaucratic recognition meant more neighborhoods could start the work with less stumbling. He celebrated the adoption in a modest way. A communal dinner, an evening where drivers and shopkeepers ate together and spoke about the changes they'd seen. There was laughter, a few thoughtful silences, and the steady sense that the world could be made a little kinder if people arranged it that way. And Jack, who had once learned to wait by the river, sat in the corner of the room and watched others take up the work he had begun. He felt the relief that comes from seeing a practice move from one pair of shoulders into a community. He thought about what would test them next. New platforms, election cycles, children who grew up and asked different questions. But for that night, he allowed himself to rest in the ordinary pleasures of food, company, and a work that, while never finished, had become less fragile. When the plates were cleared and the last coffee poured, he walked home under a sky that had forgotten how to be dramatic and felt, more plainly than he liked to admit, grateful for the steady, stubborn life he had chosen. Winter's light had a way of clarifying edges. The air felt thinner, the city noises clearer, and conversations that had drifted in summer's haze sharpened into concrete choices. Jack walked those streets with the steady patience he'd practiced for years, watching which plans weathered tests and which needed reworking. The neighborhood was no longer a project. It was a living practice. That reality brought comfort and new responsibilities. Practices must be defended, taught, and sometimes stubbornly retuned. A new kind of pressure arrived that season not as an assault but as an invitation that smelled like convenience. A national delivery platform, slick, well-funded, and confident, offered to integrate the neighborhood into its network with a promise of seamless growth. Their pitch was easy to like. Immediate access to larger markets, an app that matched drivers with higher-paying runs, and dashboards that glimmered with efficiency. On the face of it, the offer made sense. Growth could open paths for apprentices and expand the kinds of jobs available. But Jack's first thought, habitually, was the same question he'd always asked: who pays when the machine misfires? He convened a working group that mixed technologists, drivers, shopkeepers, and city staff. He didn't begin by saying no. He began by asking the platform to show soberly and in detail how the human cost metrics would be integrated into their code and their contracts. The company produced a glossy deck about uptime and market share. Jack nodded politely and then asked for a simple demonstration. Simulate a 2-week holiday surge and a sudden weather disruption, and show how the platform would react to protect a single mother who had declared caregiving constraints and 3 small shops that relied on morning deliveries for fresh stock. The request felt narrow, but it mattered. The platform's engineers returned with models that looked reasonable until Marco mapped them onto real street patterns and Lucia translated them into payroll arithmetic. The proposals assumed a certain elasticity, drivers available at the tap of a finger, shops able to adapt their hours instantly. In practice, that elasticity was limited. Drivers had children. Shop owners had morning routines fixed by practicalities like refrigeration and staffing. Jack insisted on binding conditions: automatic escrow triggers for verified missed payrolls, an enforceable human override that could not be disabled without joint agreement, and a local governance seat with veto power over broad changes during the first year of integration. Some platform executives bristled, calling the provisions unnecessary friction. Others understood the market-wise reality. A system that breaks families pays a hidden cost in attrition and reputation. After long negotiations, the platform agreed to a phased integration with hard-coded protections. It was not a perfect bargain for either side, but it was a workable one. The neighborhood accepted a cautious pilot in a constrained zone and made clear the price of expansion: shared responsibility. That outcome felt familiar to Jack: progress tempered by enforceable repair. Winter's tests rarely came alone. A municipal regulatory tweak aimed at smoothing traffic patterns in busy corridors changed permit dynamics for nighttime deliveries. On paper, it reduced congestion. In practice, it favored larger hubs with night capacities and disadvantaged smaller operators who relied on early morning windows. Jack found himself in yet another corridor of compromise, translating policy into daily lives. He asked city staff to slow implementation and offered a proposal. A phased rollout combined with a fund for micro-operators to adapt their storage or schedules. The city, already sensitive to public praise for smart measures, accepted the phased approach and added a small grant program. It wasn't dramatic, but it smoothed what would have been a sudden, painful cut. These negotiations reinforced a growing lesson for Jack. Governance is as much about timing as it is about content. A policy that seems fair on paper can hurt if deployed without time, training, or capital for adaptation. He kept teaching that lesson in council rooms, in coffee shops, and around kitchen tables. The habit of translating abstraction into the arithmetic of a family's month had become a civic practice the neighborhood could export. Not every battle was external. Inside the neighborhood, debates simmered about identity and growth. Younger operatives wanted more visible success, names in local papers, faster projects, the bustle of expansion. Older partners worried that too much shine would erode the quiet norms that had kept mornings intact. Jack bridged these perspectives by framing growth as stewardship rather than conquest. He proposed a set of public indicators that would define success beyond profit: percentages of local hiring, measurable reductions in unpaid payroll occurrences, and the percentage of revenue committed to retraining and microcredit. The metrics changed the argument. Growth that did not meet those standards was no longer merely ambitious. It was, by definition, incomplete. As the neighborhood matured, Jack's role softened in one way and deepened in another. He was less the person who took the first urgent call and more the one who made sure the structures worked when urgency arrived. He spent more time mentoring and less time firefighting. His afternoons filled with working sessions to refine protocols, tabletop exercises that rehearsed a sudden permit freeze or a tech outage, and long dinners with apprentices where they sketched out contingency plans on napkins. He enjoyed this work. It felt like tending a garden that now had roots deep enough to survive a rough season. Personal life threaded through the public work in quieter, steadier ways. A neighbor's child applied to culinary school. An older mechanic retired, leaving a small gap in the service network. Jack treated these moments as index points, signs that the neighborhood's codified care was working. He supported the mechanic's small retirement fund and helped the child get a scholarship to a local program. These gestures were not grand. They were cement. He had come to believe that infrastructure of dignity consists as much of small acts as of clauses. One evening, a journalist returned, this time with the public broadcaster, and asked to record a short documentary about how the neighborhood made morning life possible. Jack negotiated terms. No sensationalism, focus on processes, and include the apprentices' voices. The piece aired on a modest station and did something useful. It turned abstract language about escrow and human overrides into visible practices people could imitate. Dozens of calls followed from other neighborhoods asking for copies of the small manuals Lucia and Marco had been compiling. The manuals were less glamorous than political speeches, but they were portable. The spread of practical tools made Jack feel less like a gatekeeper and more like a midwife facilitating growth. Spring's thaw brought another challenge, an opportunity that felt like an ethical jigsaw. A regional logistics company wanted to consolidate several small hubs, promising cleaner streets and lower per-unit costs. It planned to centralize warehousing and introduce automated sorting that would drastically speed up throughput. In meetings, the company's executives were polished and persuasive. Their slides made the math look irresistible. But again, Jack pressed on the human arithmetic. Centralization could displace local drivers, cut small operators' margins, and shrink the local credit networks that had become the neighborhood's fragile backbone. He set out a framework for negotiation that would be a template for the years to come. The company could consolidate, but only under terms that protected local employment for a fixed transition period, guaranteed hiring preferences for displaced workers, funded a retraining pool, and subjected operational changes to a joint oversight board for the first 3 years. The company, hungry for access to an organized market and wary of political heat, accepted these conditions, though not without grumbling. The hub consolidation proceeded, but with binding protections that meant those displaced had tangible options and that the community retained bargaining power. This compromise revealed the steady economy of Jack's method. When agreements required cash commitments for the downside, investors were more cautious and governments more willing to monitor outcomes. In short, transparency and obligation create incentives to act responsibly. That seemed a simple fact to Jack, but one worth practicing because habits change markets. Not all implementations went smoothly. The new central hub, for all its modernity, had teething problems. A misconfigured sorting protocol delayed critical perishable shipments, and a driver who'd been reassigned to a longer route found himself exhausted and undercompensated for a week. The escrow and the governance board activated as designed. The driver received an immediate bridge payment, and the company funded overtime and temporary hires to smooth throughput. The response was not perfect, but it was prompt and contractual, not discretionary. The difference mattered. Where once a failure could mean weeks of unpaid wages and closed shops, now there was a playbook that guided action. By late spring, Jack watched apprentices assume tasks he'd once reserved for himself. Marco coordinated cross-district logistics with an engineer from the platform company, drawing policy lines and contingency paths on a whiteboard. Lucia chaired an audit committee, speaking in numbers and in the softer language of lives, explaining how a clause in a contract would map to a family's week. Rosa led mediation sessions between small proprietors and new hub managers, smoothing language until it became enforceable and fair. The depth of their competence eased Jack more than he expected. It also sharpened his interest in what came next, how to scale not just practices but the culture that sustained them. He understood, as he had always, that culture is not simply rules. It is the ordinary choices people make when no one is watching. So he pushed for rituals that fostered that culture. Monthly community check-ins that were practical rather than performative, rotating training slots so no single person bore new tasks alone, and small public recognitions for those who fixed things without fanfare. These rituals were hardly glamorous, but they reinforced the muscle memory that made repair ordinary. There were nights when he still walked to the river and watched lights ripple and blur. The city no longer felt as opaque as it once had. He could see the scaffolding that helped mornings arrive. He also felt the smaller, stranger satisfactions that come from seeing a practice spread. A young driver, once tempted by a higher-paying but precarious gig, now training others on schedule protections. An apprentice who set up a small credit scheme that let a baker weather a slow season without fear. These were not the things that make headlines, but they were the things that make homes. The season closed on a note that was small and precise. A modest ceremony at the community hub where a set of standard templates for escrow administration and human override processes were distributed to neighboring districts. The manuals were thin and practical, filled with checklists and sample clauses. Jack spoke briefly, not to grandstand but to give context, pilot, measure, repair, and then watched as people took the documents and, more important, began to imagine how to adapt the tools where they lived. He felt, with a kind of private contentment, that the work had moved another step away from being dependent on one person's memory and more into a practice others could perform. The neighborhood would face more tests, new platforms with new logics, political cycles that preferred headlines to habits, and the constant churn of people's lives that made repair necessary. Jack knew this and did not imagine the path would be easy. What comforted him was the muscle they had built, habits, agreements, and a culture that asked for real accountability when things went faster than people can manage. He had taught a practice that, if tended, could outlast one man's presence. On a late evening, he walked home and thought about how the city had taught him to listen and to measure. He had begun as a man who valued quiet, and he had been given the chance to teach quiet its power. The river's dark surface reflected lights that blinked and then steadied. He thought about the small things: bread warm on doorsteps, engines starting on time, a child arriving at school because a parent's shift had been honored. Those were the mornings he had worked to protect. They were the measure of a success that mattered, And with that thought, he allowed himself to sleep, for the night, without the itch of unresolved claims. The next days would require attention. He would meet them with the same quiet persistence that had brought him this far. The night before he planned to step further back, Jack walked the river one last time under a sky washed thin with stars and city light. He liked the solitude not because he wanted to be alone, but because quiet let him hear the city's small rhythms, the distant clank of a loading bay, the murmur of a late-night diner, the soft feet of a delivery driver looping back to a route. He listened like a man who had learned to listen for decades. To the tiny creaks that predict bigger shifts, and to the reassuring hum that means nothing urgent needs fixing tonight. He had thought often about endings in practical terms, how to make sure no one name held the neighborhood's fate, how to bind promises into documents and procedures so that the work would not be person-dependent. He had taught apprentices to read ledgers the way other people read maps. He'd written manuals that fit into a binder and could be carried to another room, another city, another council session. But there is a different kind of endgame, one that has nothing to do with paperwork and everything to do with temperament. It is the art of stepping back without vanishing, of letting others take the wheel while remaining available as a guide rather than the brake. That was what this night felt like, the small physics of release. He walked slowly, hands in his coat pockets, and let himself catalog the ordinary satisfactions that had become his measure of success. The baker who no longer kept 2 nights' bread in case of supply failure, the mechanic who finally took his long-awaited vacation because others could cover his shifts, the driver who last winter had kept his child's school schedule because a triage protocol had honored a caregiving flag. These were not dramatic victories. They were the sorts of daily survivals that keep cities breathing. In the months that followed, the neighborhood's life shifted gently toward the future he'd hoped for. The apprentices Marco, Lucia, Rosa, and a dozen others did not mimic him exactly, nor should they have. They brought new instincts and new questions. They pushed for digital transparency in escrow claims, advocated for community-run training centers, and suggested small public festivals that turned logjams into neighborhood celebrations. Jack liked that. He had never wanted followers. He wanted successors who would make the practice their own. He formalized a modest retirement not with a single ceremonial moment, but with a series of small, practical transfers. He placed the ledger, the battered notebook he had used since his youth, on a shelf in the community room where anyone authorized could consult it. He signed over joint governance responsibilities to a rotation of local representatives and trained a new oversight committee to respond to emergency triggers. He made sure the escrow had multiple trustees and that the human override code required both technical and community sign-offs. Each of these acts was less about relinquishing power than about distributing care. There were tender things in the process. Apprentice asked him, simply and without ceremony, whether he feared irrelevance. He thought about the question and answered honestly, "I feared being necessary for the wrong reasons. I don't fear being optional when the work is ordinary." That answer surprised him with how true it felt. The point of stewardship, he had come to believe, is not to be indispensable but to make indispensability unnecessary. A few months later, a small bell at the community hub rang for an ordinary reason. A delivery arrived ahead of schedule and a driver called in to say a road was closed and a detour worked. Lucia, who had become adept at turning policy into action, handled the call and rerouted shipments. Marco coordinated 2 drivers to cover for a mechanic's emergency, and Rosa smoothed the scheduling gap so a parent could be home for dinner. The hub hummed. The mornings kept arriving. Jack watched them from the corner with a thermos of coffee and felt, for the first time in a long while, the easy contentment of a man who had seen the plan work without him being the only person who knew how to make it so. Change continued to arrive, always it does, but now it encountered structures that had been deliberately designed for rupture. A new platform proposed faster matching algorithms. They still had to negotiate data governance and escrow contributions. A developer eyed expansion but found a board that required enforceable hiring preferences and a tested transition fund before any land was repossessed. Politicians asked for quick case studies. The neighborhood offered real numbers and process templates. These were battles that had needed to be fought and had been fought with the pragmatic insistence that has become the neighborhood's dialect. Jack did not disappear from public life. He attended dinners and meetings, not as an executive but as a witness and occasional advisor. He would speak when asked, favoring precise questions over sermonizing. He often preferred to listen, which had always been his best argument. People who once relied on him as a singular solver now came to him for perspective, for a gentle framing of the human arithmetic of their choices. He replied in the same practical language he had always used: bind promises, name costs, and insist on enforceable remedies. There were quieter rewards that came in the years after his stepping back. A small program the apprentices had launched placed local youth into technical training. A few of them returned to the neighborhood with better jobs and longer-term plans. A baker's child completed culinary school and, years later, opened their own tiny counter where morning bread sold out every day. A repair shop worker who had feared retirement found a steady source of income when the community fund helped them replace a worn compressor. These wins were not tidy or spectacular, but they were the kinds of longitudinal changes Jack had learned to value. The slow conversion of instability into dependable practice. One spring afternoon, as the city softened into warmth and people's jackets thinned on stoops, the neighborhood held a small, unpretentious ceremony. They did not invite cameras or publish press releases. It was a potluck in the hub, a sharing of simple foods, and a circulation of thanks. People read aloud short notes, some funny, some tender, about nights that had been saved, debts repaid, and small rescues that had kept families intact. Marco read a passage from the manuals they had drafted. Lucia presented a short audit showing how the escrow had been used and replenished responsibly. Rosa thanked everyone for the countless small mercies that rarely found an audience. Jack listened, grateful and quietly bemused that the ritual felt more nourishing than any accolade he might have been offered. Toward the end of the afternoon, a young driver who had once received emergency bridge funds stood and said, simply and plainly, that the neighborhood had been a place that kept me working, without losing my life. The sentence landed with the gravity of a bell. Applause was quiet and sincere. Jack found himself surprised by the lump in his throat and by how easily gratitude can make a room honest. In moments like these, the abstractions of policy and the small mechanics of escrow condensed into a single, profound effect. People could live their lives. When the potluck ended and the last dish was washed, Jack walked again to the river. The lights on the water reflected like friendly promises. He thought about durability the way he had always thought about it, not as a product of a single plan but as the accumulation of tiny, consistent acts. He thought about the apprentices, about the manuals, about the slow spread of practices to other neighborhoods. He felt the surety that the work could continue without him being a single point of contact. That did not make him feel obsolete. It made him feel relieved. As dusk became night, he let himself imagine the future in small scenes. A driver who took a paid day off for a child's recital because the system made that straightforward. A shopkeeper who invested in a new piece of equipment because microcredit made the cost manageable. A neighbor teaching another neighbor how to run an audit. These were not monumental images. They were ordinary ones, and therein lay their power. The story's arc did not bend toward dramatic grandiosity in its final pages. There were no grand last speeches or tidy final judgments. The ending was, appropriately, modest, the simple rhythm of mornings that continued to arrive. Jack found his satisfaction in that continuity, the knowledge that the mornings were no longer fragile and that the community's muscles had grown strong enough to weather the next storm. On his final evening as a formal trustee of the escrow, an administrative handover more than a ritual, he sat at the back of the community room and let the new committee speak. They were competent, precise, and human. He observed, rather than directed. When the meeting ended, someone placed the battered ledger on the table and asked if he wanted to say a few words. He declined a speech. Instead, he stood, cleared his throat, and said a single plain sentence. Keep asking who pays and keep making the repair easy. Those words were not a summons to heroism. They were a reminder of a habit. The room took them as such and went back to their work. Revising protocols, planning training sessions, mapping a route that avoided a construction zone. Life resumed. The work continued. Jack walked home slowly that night, the river reflecting the city's soft lights as if to remind him that things endure when tended. He slept well and woke the next morning to find the world unchanged and the city moving forward in its usual, splendid way. People kept opening doors and baking bread and loading trucks. The world, for all its unpredictability, carried on. The story ends not with a single dramatic flourish, but with the unremarkable miracle of continuity. Mornings that arrive, people who keep each other's promises, and a neighborhood that has learned to turn repair into habit. Jack's life, in those final chapters, had become less about a man and more about a practice passed from hand to hand. That, in his estimation, was the truest kind of legacy. He walked the river occasionally afterwards, not to check ports of call or to calculate deals, but to listen. For the soft creak of a dock, the distant laugh of early risers, the throb of engines that meant a bread oven was warming. The city's hum was a comfort. The work he had willed into being had found its own rhythm and, in that rhythm, a kind of quiet immortality. And so the tale closes gently. A life built on patient attention, a community that learned to bind promises with enforceable care, and the habit, simple and stubborn, that whenever something breaks, people make repair easier than neglect. The mornings continue as mornings always do, and in that, continuing lies the story's quiet, steady end.